There is a conversation about trauma that we are very good at having. We understand what trauma is, what it does to the brain and the body, the ways it reorganizes a nervous system and rewrites a life. We have frameworks for the damage, good ones, important ones, hard one over decades of research and clinical work. There is another conversation, a more careful, more tentative one, because it is easy to get wrong, about what sometimes happens on the other side of trauma that the damage frameworks cannot fully account for. About the people who do not simply return to who they were before. Who come out of their most shattering experiences not unchanged, not unscathed, but in some ways fundamentally different, not despite what they went through but in ways that are inseparable from it. Who describe a clarity about what matters. A depth of relationship that was not available to them before. A strength they did not know they possessed. A sense of meaning that did not exist before the event that tried to destroy them. This is not a promise. It is not a requirement. It is not something that happens because trauma is secretly a gift or because everything happens for a reason. It is a documented psychological phenomenon with 3 decades of rigorous research behind it, and understanding it precisely, without either sentimentalizing it or dismissing it, is one of the most important things this video can offer. It is called post-traumatic growth. And today we are building the complete, honest, clinically grounded picture of what it is, what the research shows, how it actually happens, what conditions support it, and what its honest limitations are. The post-traumatic growth cheat sheet is in the description. Let's begin. Section 1. What post-traumatic growth actually is, 130 to 330. Post-traumatic growth, PTG, was formally defined and systematically researched beginning in the 1990s by psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun at the University of North Carolina. Their definition is precise and it is worth holding carefully. Post-traumatic growth is positive psychological change experienced as a result of the struggle with highly challenging life circumstances. 3 elements of that definition deserve close attention. First, it is positive psychological change, not simply coping, not simply survival, not simply the return to pre-trauma functioning. It is change that goes beyond the person's previous level of functioning in specific, measurable domains. Something genuinely new has been built that was not there before. Second, it occurs as a result of the struggle, not the event itself, but the wrestling with it, the attempt to make sense of it, the confrontation with assumptions about the world that the trauma has shattered. The growth emerges from the engagement with the disruption, not from the disruption alone. And third, the circumstances must be highly challenging, genuinely seismic in their disruption of the person's assumptive world, the set of beliefs about safety, fairness, meaning, and the self that most people carry without examining until something shatters them. What PTG is not is equally important. It is not resilience, though it is frequently conflated with it. Resilience is the capacity to resist disruption, to bounce back to previous functioning, to maintain relative stability in the face of adversity. PTG is what happens when disruption cannot be resisted, when the trauma is significant enough that the person cannot simply return to who they were. Resilience preserves the pre-trauma self. PTG transforms it. The two can coexist, but they describe different processes and different outcomes. PTG is not universal. The research is clear that not all trauma survivors experience PTG, and the absence of growth after trauma is not evidence of failure, weakness, or insufficient effort. The conditions that produce PTG are specific, the individual differences that mediate it are significant, and some traumas, some contexts, and some levels of severity produce outcomes that are more accurately described as chronic impairment than as transformation. PTG is a real phenomenon that occurs in a meaningful proportion of trauma survivors. It is not an obligation. And PTG is not the elimination of suffering. One of the most clinically important findings in PTG research is that growth and distress co-occur, that the same person who reports significant positive changes in the wake of trauma also continues to experience the pain, the loss, the ongoing difficulty of what happened. PTG does not replace the wound. It grows alongside it. Section 2, the research, Tedeschi, Calhoun, and the science, 3:30 to 5 o'clock. Tedeschi and Calhoun's research program, which began with qualitative interviews with bereaved parents and other trauma survivors in the early 1990s, identified a consistent pattern of positive change across populations and trauma types that they initially called adversarial growth, a term that captures something important about its origin in genuine adversity rather than in ordinary difficulty. Their landmark contribution was the Post-Traumatic Growth Inventory, the PTGI, a validated measure of growth across 5 domains that has been used in hundreds of subsequent studies across trauma populations worldwide. The consistency of the findings across very different cultures, very different types of trauma, and very different populations is one of the most compelling features of the PTG literature. The basic structure of growth, the domains in which it occurs, the processes through which it emerges, appears to be genuinely cross-cultural and robust. Subsequent research has expanded significantly on Tedeschi and Calhoun's foundational work. Studies examining PTG across cancer survivors, combat veterans, disaster survivors, abuse survivors, and people navigating bereavement have consistently found PTG rates ranging from 30 to 90% of survivors, with significant variation depending on the severity of the trauma, the time since the event, the availability of social support, and the individual's characteristic ways of processing challenging experience. Viktor Frankl's logotherapy, developed from his own experience of surviving Nazi concentration camps, is perhaps the most profound clinical and philosophical precursor to the PTG framework, the argument that the search for meaning in suffering is not merely an adaptive response but a fundamental human drive. The research also consistently shows that PTG is not simply a function of time passing. It is a function of engagement, the active, often painful cognitive and emotional processing of the traumatic experience that produces the narrative reconstruction and schema change that are the psychological mechanisms of growth. Time without processing does not produce PTG. Processing, however nonlinear, however difficult, does. Section 3, the 5 domains of post-traumatic growth, 5 o'clock to 7:30. Tedeschi and Calhoun's research identified 5 specific domains in which post-traumatic growth occurs, 5 areas of positive change that consistently emerge across trauma survivors who report PTG. Understanding these domains is essential both for recognizing growth when it is occurring and for supporting its development in clinical work. Domain 1, personal strength. The first domain is the discovery of personal strength, specifically, the recognition of a resilience and capacity for survival that the person did not know they possessed before the trauma. People who report growth in this domain describe a qualitative shift in their relationship to their own capabilities, not simply confidence, but the bone-deep knowledge that comes from having survived something that they were not certain they could survive. This is not the same as feeling invincible, and importantly, it often coexists with a more realistic, less defended relationship to vulnerability. The paradoxical finding that PTG survivors frequently report both greater strength and greater openness to their own fragility reflects the genuine complexity of what the trauma has produced. Domain 2, relating to others. The second domain is improved relationships, specifically, an increased capacity for intimacy, empathy, compassion, and authentic connection. People who report growth in this domain describe a deepening of their most important relationships, a reduced tolerance for superficial connection, a greater ability to be present to other people's suffering because they have been present to their own, and sometimes a significant reorganization of their social world, a falling away of relationships that were not genuine and an intensification of those that were. Trauma often reveals, with great clarity, who the person's actual community is. And the experience of being held through the worst changes how relationship is understood and valued. Domain 3, new possibilities. The third domain is the opening of new possibilities, the recognition, often through the shattering of old assumptions and old identities, that paths and purposes are available that were not previously visible or pursued. People who report growth in this domain describe career changes, new creative pursuits, advocacy work born from their own experience, spiritual exploration that would not have happened without the crisis, or simply a sense that the person they were before was more constrained by fear and assumption than they had realized, and that the trauma, by destroying those constraints, has paradoxically opened space for a more self-authored life. Domain 4. Appreciation of life. The fourth domain is a changed appreciation of life, a deepened sense of the preciousness of ordinary experience, a reduced tendency to take for granted the relationships and moments that were previously assumed to be permanent. People who report growth in this domain describe a perceptual shift. The same life that existed before the trauma looks different afterward. Not because the external circumstances have changed, but because the trauma's confrontation with loss, mortality, and contingency has permanently altered the framework through which experience is evaluated. What was invisible because it was assumed becomes vivid because it is no longer taken for granted. Domain 5. Spiritual and existential change. The fifth domain is spiritual and existential change, shifts in religious belief, spiritual practice, philosophical worldview, and the person's relationship to the fundamental questions of meaning, mortality, and what a life is for. This domain is the most variable across individuals and cultures. For some people, trauma deepens existing religious faith. For others, it produces a radical questioning of previous beliefs. For others still, it produces a new spiritual orientation that was not present before. What is consistent across PTG research is that trauma reliably produces engagement with existential questions that was not occurring before, a confrontation with meaning, mortality, and the nature of a well-lived life that the pre-trauma person may never have undertaken. Section 4. Why struggle is the engine, not the obstacle, 7:30 to 9 o'clock. One of the most counterintuitive and most clinically important insights in all of PTG research is that the suffering, the struggling, the difficulty of the aftermath, these are not obstacles to growth that must be overcome before growth can begin. They are the engine of growth. The struggle is not what PTG happens despite. It is what PTG happens through. Tedeschi and Calhoun describe the mechanism through the concept of the shattered assumptive world. Every person carries, largely below conscious awareness, a set of core assumptions about how the world works, that it is generally safe, that it is broadly fair, that the self is worthy and capable, that the future is predictable and controllable, that the relationships that matter will persist. These assumptions form the scaffolding of everyday functioning. They allow people to move through the world without constant existential reckoning because the foundational questions have, implicitly, been answered. Significant trauma does not simply produce negative emotions. It shatters these assumptions, revealing them as assumptions, exposing the degree to which the person's entire orientation to the world was built on premises that the trauma has now shown to be contingent rather than certain. The world is not always safe. Good things do happen to good people. The body can betray. The relationships that were assumed to be permanent can end. The future that was planned cannot be counted on. This shattering is genuinely devastating. And it is also, in Tedeschi and Calhoun's framework, the precondition for growth, because reconstruction of the assumptive world following its shattering is not simply the restoration of what was there before. It is the building of something new. A worldview that is more complex, more honest about contingency and uncertainty, more genuinely chosen rather than simply inherited. The person who has rebuilt their assumptive world after its shattering has built something that did not exist before, something that could only have been built from the rubble of what the trauma destroyed. This is why attempts to bypass or prematurely resolve the struggle, to move too quickly toward acceptance or meaning before the full weight of what happened has been genuinely engaged with, tend to produce what researchers call illusory PTG, a performed positivity that masks unprocessed distress rather than reflecting genuine transformation. Real PTG is built through the struggle, not around it. Section 5. The conditions that support PTG, 9 o'clock to 11 o'clock. PTG does not emerge uniformly across all trauma survivors, and the research has identified specific conditions and individual characteristics that most consistently support its development. Understanding these is clinically important because it identifies what can be cultivated rather than simply hoped for. Cognitive processing is the most central condition. PTG is a fundamentally cognitive phenomenon. It emerges through the effortful, often painful work of making sense of what happened, revising assumptions that the trauma has shattered, and constructing a narrative that integrates the trauma into the larger story of the person's life in a way that produces meaning rather than simply recording damage. This processing is not linear. It involves intrusion and avoidance, repeated engagement and withdrawal, the gradual movement from fragmented emotional processing toward more narrative, integrated understanding. But it is irreplaceable. The conditions that support cognitive processing, time, safety, adequate regulation, and the presence of supportive others who can witness without requiring the person to be further along than they are the conditions that support PTG. Social support is the second critical condition. The research consistently shows that the availability of at least one person who can provide genuine emotional support, not problem solving, not silver linings, not the pressure to recover on a schedule, is one of the strongest predictors of PTG. Being witnessed in the struggle, having the experience reflected back in a way that validates its significance, and receiving the message that the person is not alone in navigating the aftermath are all conditions that support the processing that makes growth possible. The co-regulation that safe social connection provides is also physiologically significant. It creates the nervous system conditions in which the kind of deep cognitive processing that PTG requires can occur. Narrative processing, specifically, the construction of a coherent narrative about the traumatic experience and its aftermath, is the mechanism through which cognitive processing most reliably produces growth. Expressive writing research by James Pennebaker has demonstrated consistently that putting difficult emotional experiences into words produces psychological and physiological benefits that passive rumination does not. The construction of narrative does something specific. It transforms a fragmented, overwhelming sensory and emotional experience into a story, something with a beginning, a middle, and a narrative arc that points toward, if not guarantees, a direction. The story does not resolve the trauma. It organizes it, and organization is the beginning of integration. Individual characteristics also matter. PTG is more consistently reported in people with higher levels of openness to experience, the personality dimension associated with curiosity, flexibility, and willingness to engage with novel and challenging ideas. It is associated with spiritual or philosophical frameworks that can accommodate suffering within a larger meaning structure. And it is associated with what researchers call deliberate rumination, the intentional, reflective engagement with the traumatic experience, as distinct from intrusive rumination, which is the unwanted, uncontrolled, repetitive flooding of traumatic material that maintains distress without producing integration. Section 6, Critiques, Honest Limitations, and PTG in Clinical Practice, 11 o'clock to 1300. Post-traumatic growth is a genuine and robustly documented phenomenon. It is also a concept that has been misapplied, sentimentalized, and weaponized in ways that cause harm, and any intellectually honest treatment of PTG requires engaging directly with the critiques and limitations that the research itself has raised. The most significant critique is the problem of socially desirable reporting. Some researchers have questioned whether PTG scores on self-report measures reflect genuine psychological transformation or whether they reflect the social desirability of reporting positive change, the pressure, internalized or external, to find the silver lining, to demonstrate resilience, to be the person who grew through their suffering rather than the person who was simply damaged by it. The concern is that PTG as measured may partly capture what people feel they should report rather than what they have actually experienced. More recent research using longitudinal designs and behavioral measures alongside self-report has found evidence that at least a significant portion of reported PTG reflects genuine change, but the concern about illusory PTG, particularly in contexts where growth is implicitly expected or rewarded, remains clinically relevant. The risk of instrumentalizing suffering is the second concern. When PTG becomes a cultural expectation, when the implicit message is that trauma is an opportunity for growth and that people who don't grow from their trauma have somehow failed, it produces a new form of harm layered on top of the original. The person who is simply struggling, who has not yet found meaning, who is in the middle of the devastation without any visible horizon of transformation, does not need to be reminded that other people grow from their trauma. They need the same unconditional witnessing that PTG research identifies as the precondition for growth, and that witnessing cannot be conditional on growth occurring. PTG does not require a therapist to facilitate it. But therapy can create the specific conditions: safety, reflective space, supportive relational presence, and skilled facilitation of narrative processing, that support its emergence. The therapist's role is not to produce growth or to push toward it. It is to create the conditions in which the person's own processing can proceed without being shut down by overwhelm, without being rushed by external pressure, and with the kind of skilled witnessing that makes the most difficult cognitive and emotional work possible. Practically, this means validating the struggle before any mention of growth. Ensuring that the person's experience of what trauma has cost is fully witnessed before the conversation turns to what it might produce. Recognizing growth when it is present without requiring it or pointing toward it prematurely. And holding, with equal respect and patience, the reality of the person who is living through the aftermath and not yet, and possibly not ever, experiencing PTG, whose suffering is equally valid and equally deserving of skilled clinical care. The post-traumatic growth cheat sheet in the description covers the 5 domains, the conditions that support PTG, and reflection prompts for the growth journey, designed for personal use in the aftermath of significant adversity and for therapists supporting clients through this territory. Outro, 1300 to 1400, trauma takes things. Real things, irreplaceable things, things that should not have been taken. And nothing in this video is an argument that it doesn't, or that the taking is acceptable, or that there is an obligation to be grateful for what was lost. What the research on post-traumatic growth offers is something more modest and more honest than that. It offers the documented reality that some people, not all, not automatically, not without enormous struggle, come out of the worst experiences of their lives not simply diminished, but in some ways genuinely larger. With a more honest relationship to what matters. With a depth of connection that was not available before. With a relationship to their own strength that could only have been built in the furnace of something that tried to destroy them. That is not a silver lining. It is not a consolation. It is an honest account of what can happen when the shattered pieces are gathered up and rebuilt into something new, something that could not have been built any other way. If you are in the rubble right now and the horizon of growth is not visible to you, that is where this begins. Not at the horizon. In the rubble. With the witnessing. With the surviving. With the willingness to keep going when the direction is not yet clear. That is where PTG starts, for every single person it has ever happened to. The cheat sheet is in the description. Share this video with someone who needs to know that what they are going through does not have to be the final word about who they are. And I will see you in the next one.